Olá, boa noite. Sejam muito bem-vindos ao Roda Viva. Estamos no ar para todo o Brasil pela TV Cultura e emissoras afiliadas. Conectados ao mundo todo pelas principais plataformas digitais e pelo app Cultura Play. Poucos temas mobilizam tanto pais e educadores como o vício em telas, que drena a atenção e, em casos mais graves, a saúde mental da chamada geração Z. A avidez por orientação a respeito de como agir com algo tão disseminado quanto o acesso cada vez mais precoce de crianças e adolescentes a celulares com câmeras frontais e acesso a redes sociais fez com que um livro que enfrenta esse assunto se tornasse um best-seller global. Em A Geração Ansiosa, lançado no Brasil em julho pela Companhia das Letras, o nosso entrevistado de hoje propõe ações que muitos consideraram bastante drásticas para restringir e postergar o acesso a essas tecnologias e, com isso, tentar reverter dados alarmantes da incidência de ansiedade, depressão, automutilação e até suicídio entre crianças e adolescentes. Para discutir as maneiras práticas de reverter o que ele chama de a grande reconfiguração da infância, com a abolição do hábito de brincar e o uso massivo de telas, nós recebemos remotamente hoje, a partir dos Estados Unidos, o psicólogo social e professor da Universidade de Nova York, Jonathan Haidt.
Jonathan David Haidt nasceu em 19 de outubro de 1963 em Nova York. É formado em filosofia pela Universidade de Yale, com doutorado em psicologia pela Universidade da Pensilvânia e pós-doutorado na Universidade de Chicago. Desenvolveu a teoria das fundações morais, que pretende explicar o comportamento moral por meio da perspectiva evolutiva. Foi professor nas universidades de Virgínia, Princeton e atualmente está na Universidade de Nova York. Participou do docudrama O Dilema das Redes, produzido em 2020 pela Netflix, e lançou neste ano o best-seller A Geração Ansiosa, editado no Brasil pela Companhia das Letras.
Para entrevistar o Jonathan Haidt, nós convidamos Michel Alcoforado, antropólogo e pesquisador, Maria Clara Cabral, diretora de redação da revista Qual é?, Leon Ferrari, repórter de saúde do jornal O Estado de São Paulo, Isabela Palhares, repórter da Folha de São Paulo, e Januária Cristina Alves, colunista do Nexo Jornal. Contamos ainda com os desenhos em cima do laço do nosso Luciano Veronese e a tradução simultânea será feita pela Leslie Benzaquem. Boa noite, Jonathan. Muito obrigada por ter aceitado o nosso convite para estar aqui com a gente. O seu livro já é um best-seller no Brasil, já tinha fila de espera por ele antes mesmo dele ser lançado. E eu queria começar pelo começo. Como foi que você detectou que entre crianças e jovens nascidos depois de 1995 se aí configurou uma espécie de epidemia de ansiedade, de problemas de saúde mental e até de casos mais graves como suicídio, sobretudo por um advento que surgiu nos anos 2010?
Well, first, let me say it's a real pleasure to learn that my book is doing well in Brazil and to be speaking with you today. I have a special tie to Brazil in that I did my dissertation research there in 1989. I spent 2 months in Brazil working with professors in Porto Alegre and in Recife. I love the country, and I'm looking forward. I will be visiting at some point in May or April, something like that. So to your question, we first detected it because I'm a college professor, and all of a sudden, in 2014, the students coming in were much more depressed and anxious, fragile, easily offended, easily upset. We'd never seen anything like it. Now, with mental health statistics, it often takes a couple years between when things are measured and when we academics know about the results. So it wasn't until 2017 that we began to see graphs of especially anxiety and depression. They were very stable. The levels were very stable from the late 1990s all the way through 2010, 2011. There's no sign of a problem. And then all of a sudden, 2012, 2013, all the numbers go shooting up like a hockey stick. So it was clear in our classrooms, it was clear in these large data sets, and we started everyone working with kids started saying, what's going on? Why are they so fragile?
E aí, o que vocês detectaram era que o problema principal era com o advento dos celulares com câmeras frontais e acesso às redes sociais, é isso?
Well, it took a while to figure out the story, and the key was once we discovered that it wasn't just happening in the U.S., it was happening identically in all the English-speaking countries. Certainly in Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. It was happening in Scandinavia. It wasn't happening in Eastern Europe so much. So it's not every single country, but it seems to be most countries. And since it happened globally, you can't just point to like something in the United States. You have to look for a global cause. And so basically either it's the change in childhood that happened in the early 2010s, or somebody released a chemical somewhere, in most parts of the world in 2011 that suddenly made young people depressed. And I don't think that's what happened. So yes, it's the book, The Anxious Generation, tells the story of the great rewiring of childhood from a play-based childhood, which is what we used to have, at least in the United States when I was growing up, to a phone-based childhood. Kids don't go out and play very much. They're not allowed to. We think it's too dangerous, so we keep them on their phones all the time, and we think that's safe, but it's not safe. So that's, I think, what the cause of this international epidemic is.
Leon.
Prazer entrevistá-lo. Professor, o seu argumento central no livro tem esses dois lados. Mais smartphone, mais rede social e menos brincar livre. No entanto, desde que o livro foi lançado, o debate parece muito centrado só no telefone, só nas redes sociais e muito pouco no brincar livre. Pergunto por que o senhor acha que a gente está falando muito menos do brincar livre e queria que o senhor explicasse para o telespectador o que configura esse brincar livre.
Sure. So, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about what childhood is. This is not just a book about, social media is bad, get your kids off social media. We have to first understand, why do we have this long human childhood? Ours is very slow. Other species, they grow very quickly until they can reproduce, and they reproduce. We slow down. We have this long period, age 4 or 5 through about 11, 12, where there's very slow growth. That appears to be a cultural apprenticeship, a period for learning basic skills and then learning your culture. And so the way that kids learn best is from free play, being unsupervised by adults. That's how they learn to take responsibility for themselves. In the United States, we changed all that in the 1990s. We got very afraid that our children would be kidnapped or hit by a car, and we brought them inside. We did not let them out to play. We thought it was too dangerous. And we deprived them of play. All mammals play. Baby monkeys, baby squirrels, baby goats. That's what mammals have to do to wire up their brains. And if you take out most of the play, most of the independence, most of the sunshine, most of the shared laughter, if you take out all those things, take out 60% of them from a human childhood and replace it with 5 hours a day of social media, mostly watching short videos, if you do that, you're going to steer neural development in different ways, and you're going to get a different kind of human being. And that, I think, is what happened to Gen Z. When we changed very quickly from the play-based childhood to the phone-based childhood between 2010 and 2015, and the kids who went through puberty during that time came out differently. I'm sorry, to directly address your question, I don't think there's much controversy about what I just said. Nobody is disputing me. Nobody is saying, height is wrong. Kids don't need to play. Of course they do. So there's no controversy around the idea that we need far more free play and unsupervised play. The controversy is between me and a group of about 6 to 10 researchers who say that, there's no evidence of harm. But I hope, as we'll talk about today, there's a lot of evidence of harm.
Certo, Michel.
Jonathan, a epidemia de problemas de saúde mental é uma realidade no Brasil também. Não à toa seu livro fez tanto sucesso por aqui. Mas quando a gente olha ao longo da história, momentos de grandes transformações sociais, em geral, dão em sofrimento. Na virada do século XIX para o século XX, com a entrada da modernidade, as neuróticas pararam no consultório do Freud e nas artes teve um certo pessimismo e uma depressão. Quando a gente olha para os anos de 1970, a gente vê que depois da Revolução dos Costumes, houve um boom dos saberes psis e das drogas psicodélicas. E agora, mais uma vez, a vida está pelo avesso pelo impacto das plataformas digitais. Por que você acha que dessa vez a gente precisa se preocupar? E por que a gente está à beira de um colapso?
This new technology has spread faster and is more pervasive than anything that's ever happened. Think about how much life changed when we got electricity. Life changed radically, but that was over 30, 50 years. When we got computers, life changed, but very slowly. There's never been a change this fast. And it's not just affecting kids. If you think about it, almost everyone listening here, if you're an adult, do you feel the technology, that at least social media and having a phone, do you feel it has improved your psychological well-being? Or do you feel overwhelmed, just constantly interrupted, fragmented? It's harder to do anything that takes concentration. We're experiencing very rapid change in almost everything about the way we live, the way we talk, the way we have sex, or certainly the way children learn about sex, the things we focus on, the fact that our reputations are so vulnerable to being shattered instantly. This is a terrible way to live. It's having pervasive effects around the world on adults as well as young people. But I'm focused on the young people because when you change things during puberty, that's the key thing to focus on. When you go through in puberty, the brain is rewiring very rapidly from the child form to the adult form. So puberty is a very sensitive time. Let's say ages 11 to 15 or so is early puberty. That's the most sensitive time for brain development, other than the first 3 years. And what do? All around the world, kids are getting on Instagram and TikTok around the age of 10 or 11. And so they're going through puberty entirely on social media. And that, I think, is blocking their emotional development, their confidence, their social skills. For the boys especially, everyone says that it's hard to get them to make eye contact. There's just pervasive deficits when you don't have a normal, play-based, socially interactive childhood.
Isabela.
Oi, professor. Prazer entrevistá-lo. Professor, os pais da geração Z também são usuários muito assíduos das redes sociais e dos celulares, mas no seu livro e em entrevistas anteriores eu vi que o senhor não considera que esse comportamento dos pais seja tão determinante ou que ele influencie tanto as crianças e adolescentes. Por que o senhor acha que o exemplo dos pais não é tão determinante para um uso saudável dos celulares?
Yeah. So first, I'm going by the data. When you graph that, so in the United States, we have very good longitudinal data, surveys stretching back 30 to 50 years. And some of them are just young people, but some are people of all ages. And so we can see that when we trace out these lines from the 90s through 2011, there's no change for anyone, really, no big trends. And then the lines for Gen Z go shooting up. But the lines for middle-aged people and older, they stay very flat. So the levels of depression and anxiety in adults and older people born before, let's say before the millennials, certainly. So let's say before 1980. People born before 1980, at least in the United States, they're not going up in depression and anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a problem. And so, as I said before, we're all feeling fragmented and overwhelmed. But I'm not focusing on the adults because when we look at the costs and benefits of social media for adults, there are many benefits. Many businesses depend on Instagram or other platforms. So if an adult makes an informed choice to use social media, even though the platforms are designed to be addictive, that's their choice. And there are many reasons they might want to do that. Social media can be a tool that we use to advance our goals. But when we look at children, when we look at especially young teens, age 10 to 13, what are the benefits? I see zero benefits to spending hours a day on Instagram and TikTok. Zero. I can't find a single good thing that happens to children when they do that. At the same time, the harms are greatest in early puberty. So this is why I'm so focused on puberty. That's where we need to start as a society. I'm not going to tell adults what they should do, but I do have a chapter in the book on spiritual degradation. That is, we all feel kind of brought down. It doesn't make us nobler and better.
Maria Clara.
Jonathan, no seu livro você faz algumas recomendações para tentar frear essa crise de saúde mental nos jovens, nos adolescentes. Primeiramente, eu queria que o senhor falasse para a gente quais são elas e sobre uma específica eu vou me adiantar de barrar os celulares nas escolas, escolas livres de celular. Não seria o caso de, ao invés de proibir os celulares, educá-los para usar de maneira correta?
So big picture here is what I'm calling for is 4 norms. We got into this trap because everyone else was doing something and we had to do it. Our children had to have a smartphone because everyone else had it. Our children had to be on Instagram because everybody else was. So the only way out of this is collectively. If we all say we're not going to give our kids a smartphone until age 14, that's the first norm. We're not going to let them have a social media account, especially not Instagram or TikTok, until they're 16. The third norm is phone-free schools. We must get the phones out of the schools. That is, children must lock them up when they come to school, put them in a pouch or a locker, and they get them back at the end of the day. And the fourth norm is more free play and independence in the real world. So those are the 4 norms. The first 2 are about keeping kids away from smartphones and social media for a while. Now, many people say, why don't we just educate them? Well, we tried that. Nobody's having luck with that. These things are so addictive. When a kid has a smartphone, they have the entire internet in their pocket. They have millions of companies trying to get to them to catch their attention. And the ones that are best at catching attention are the ones that become popular. So you only get one childhood. And since education is very, very weak on this, 10, 11, 12-year-olds, they don't have a well-developed frontal cortex. They can't just say, oh, this is bad for me, so I won't do it. If everyone is sending Snapchat messages or everyone's talking about a TikTok video, the kid is going to do it too. And they're going to do it during class. My children went to New York City public schools. The rule is, oh, you're not allowed to take out your phone during class, but everyone does. You hide it in your book, you sit in the back row. So the teachers are universal on this. The teachers hate the phones. They can't reach the students because they're on their phones. Even if they seem to be looking at you, they're thinking about the drama that's going on the phone. So phone-free schools, that is essential. It's easy. It always gets good results, always. I've looked for schools that did it and they had to undo it because it was bad. I can't find them. Almost every school that goes phone-free says the same thing. We hear laughter in the hallways again. It used to be that everyone was just on their phones when they were in between classes, but now we hear them talking and laughing. And that's a much better education. Students are going to enjoy school if they can talk with their friends. They don't enjoy it when it's constant internet drama all day long. And then they go home and it's constant internet drama all afternoon and all evening long.
Certo, Januária, por favor.
Boa noite, muito obrigada pela entrevista. Eu, como escritora de livros infantos juvenis, acredito muito na literatura como forma de educar crianças e jovens e de promover o que o nosso educador Paulo Freire chama de leitura do mundo. Eu gostaria de saber a sua opinião sobre a leitura e, em especial, sobre a leitura de livros digitais. A gente tem pesquisadores, neurocientistas, como a doutora Maiane Wolff, preocupadas também com o excesso de leitura no mundo digital. Gostaria de ouvir a sua opinião a respeito.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm certainly a huge fan of reading books. A book takes a long time to read. You immerse yourself in a person's ideas or in a story for a long period of time. Stories are good. Humans evolved with stories. We tell stories around the campfire. So if a student can immerse him or herself in a book or even in a movie that go, for many hours, that's a good thing. But what happens when you have a digital device, I do all my reading on Kindle because it's just easy I have it everywhere, I can copy and paste. But when I'm reading on this thing, I then check the weather. I check how my book is doing on Amazon. I look at my texts, and I constantly get distracted. So I do think that paper books are incredibly valuable. And from what we hear, and actually the data shows, young people are reading very few books. The level of reading books, it's been going down since the 1970s, but it's going down very fast now. Many children read no books. They can't. They don't have the ability to stick with a book that long. We're even seeing this among college students. It's very hard for them to read a book. The debate has mostly focused on mental illness, but we need to bring in the educational declines, which are global since 2012, and we need to bring in the shattering of the ability to pay attention. And this is what the electronic life is doing to kids. I say we need to get the phones out of schools first, but next we're going to have to get the iPads and Chromebooks out, especially for the younger kids. All of these things came in 2012. Education now is you're on a screen all day long, and that means you're texting all day long, and that means you're distracted all day long. So it's going to be much harder to change schools because they're now, since COVID, they are so dependent on digital technology for the whole school day. But I think we need to examine that. There's not much evidence that digital technology has helped. There are many indications that the distraction effects are so big that we probably should get rid of most of it.
Com isso, então, a gente fecha o nosso primeiro bloco com o Jonathan Haidt, vai para um rápido intervalo e volta já já com o Roda Viva.
Educação que transforma. Bradesco.
Estamos de volta com Roda Viva, que hoje recebe o psicólogo social, professor da NYU, Jonathan Haidt. Eu queria falar sobre o que você mencionou numa resposta anterior a respeito dos que contestam as evidências sobre a correlação entre o uso de telas e essa crise de saúde mental. Você disse que há muitas evidências, mas, por exemplo, pesquisadores, até jornalistas, apontam que a crise de saúde mental é comum a todas as idades, então que não haveria essa correlação com o uso de telas entre jovens. Você contesta, é isso, Jonathan?
Well, first, it's not common to all ages. It's concentrated among those born after 1995. People who are in their 40s and 50s and 60s are not getting more depressed, at least not in the United States. Secondly, on the evidence of correlation versus causation, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies that just ask kids, how many hours a day do you spend on social media or on your phone or on video games? And then they ask, how's your mental health, or are you anxious, or they give them a 5-point scale. So we have, what is the correlation between the number of hours, they say, and their report of their anxiety? And the finding is almost always that there is a correlation, but it's a very small number. You get correlations around 0.1. The correlation coefficient is 0.1, which is not uncommon in mental health effects, but it is relatively small. But here's the thing. We know that harm is being done at an industrial scale. We know this from the companies themselves. In each of the companies, especially Meta, whistleblowers, the employees who came forward within the company and said, hey, massive sexual harassment is coming on. 15% of kids received a sexual advance on Instagram in the last week. We just got revelations from Snapchat. In the United States, one of our attorney generals, the state of New Mexico, is suing Snapchat. And in the legal process, they got internal memos from the company. It turns out they get 10,000 complaints a month of sextortion, where someone pretends to be a sexy young woman and they flirt with a boy, it's especially hitting boys. They flirt with a boy and they say, hey, here's a photo of me, send me a photo of you. And then when you get a photo of the boy showing his penis, then the person reveals that they're not a sexy young woman. They're an extortion ring based somewhere around the world. Mm-hmm. And they say, give me this amount of money or I will show your photo to all of your friends because I'm connected to all of your friends. The FBI, so 10,000 reports a month of this sort of thing. And that's only the ones that are reported. So we're talking millions and millions of young people are being sextorted every year just on Snapchat. And many of them kill themselves. I mean, not most, obviously, but the FBI found in a sample of 16,000 reports, they found 21 suicides because many kids, when they're so shamed, they just kill themselves. So harm is being done at an industrial scale. So why doesn't it show up in the correlational studies? Sure. And the reason is because the correlational studies are taking very crude measures of just a small piece of the puzzle. There are so many harms happening to kids, such as sextortion. Is that kid, that doesn't show up when you just look at how many hours a day you're spending. Hours a day picks up a tiny portion of the variance of all the different harms. And then these researchers say, oh, well, look, the correlation is so tiny, so there's no harm. Wait a second. We have evidence that millions of children are being harmed. So I think there's just a problem in the kind of research that the social scientists have focused on. One more thing that we do in the social sciences is we say, we're going to blend together all the platforms, everything they do electronically, even if Instagram is what's causing depression for girls. And they say, we're going to blend together boys and girls, even though the depression link is especially through girls. And they say, we're going to blend together every possible outcome. Are you happy? Positive and negative, even though when you zoom in on anxiety and depression, you always find bigger effects. My point is, the research base that we're all using is what I call blender studies. If you want your child to eat vegetables, you put them in a blender with other stuff, you can't see it anymore. Same thing with the data. There are massive harms going all around, but you blend them all together in a study and you say, look, the correlation is only 0.1, it's small, but you're missing almost the whole story.
Certo, Maria Clara.
Jonathan, falando ainda das redes sociais, a Meta anunciou recentemente a criação do Instagram Teen Accounts, prometendo oferecer um maior controle parental. Eu vi um comentário seu, aí me corrija, por favor, se eu estiver equivocado, que era um primeiro passo importante, mas que ações muito mais robustas ainda precisariam ser feitas. Quais são essas ações? Você consegue nos dizer por parte das Big Techs, das grandes empresas de tecnologia?
Sure. So most of the focus for reform efforts has been on content, on what do the platforms show, can we do more content moderation, how do we stop them sending content about eating disorders to girls who want to lose weight, how do we stop them sending suicide content to teens who are depressed. But content is only a small piece of what's going on. Now, my view is that these platforms are wildly inappropriate for minors. For children, they simply should not be on a platform where there's no age verification, so they can be 9 years old, they can be anything, where it's full of other people, including men around the world, who want sex with them or money from them, strangers who are not verified, hosted by companies that are not legally liable. In the United States, we created this terrible problem. And we said there's a law, it's called Section 230. There's a law that says we can't sue the companies for whatever they do because they're not publishers, they're just platforms. So we have a perfect storm to create a race to grab kids and keep them on with no concern for their welfare. And that's why we have industrial scale harm. So I don't think there's any way to fix this. There's no way to make Instagram safe for 10-year-olds, even for 13-year-olds. There's no way to do it. If Instagram could only show nice photos of other kids having happy lives, would this be good for 12-year-old girls to flip through photos of other 12-year-old girls who are prettier and happier than they are, or at least appear to be? No, there is no way to fix this. It's just completely inappropriate for children. So the big thing we need to do is raise the age. Ideally, it would be 18. If you're legally an adult, okay, fine, you can take these risks, and there may be some uses for you. But if you're under 18, we should treat this the way we treat gambling, the way we treat alcohol, the way we treat tobacco. It's just not appropriate for children. So I'd like the age to be raised to 18. But my goal as a social psychologist is not to find the perfect level, it's to find the achievable level. We have to get a norm. And the norm, I believe, should be 16. That I think we could get, that we could do. Parents can just wait. They can just say, no, you can't have it. And if a lot of us do it, then it'll be much easier. But really what we need is the law. Really what we need is age verification. Right now, the legal age for opening accounts is 13. At 13, you're allowed to give away your data and be treated like an adult without your parents knowing that you're on the platform. That's the current law. It's terrible. And there's no age verification requirement. We need to raise that to 16 and put the responsibility on the companies to verify the age. Parents can't do it. We can't keep our kids away from pornography, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat. We can't keep them away unless we keep them away from the internet. So we need government mandates that the companies play a big part in age verification. That would be a game changer. One thing I do like about the new Instagram accounts is that Instagram has for the first time said 16 is a significant age, which is very important. They say below 16, you can't change the privacy defaults without your parents' involvement. If you're over 16, then you can do anything and the world can do anything to you. But at least it says under 16. Now, of course, that just means that 10-year-olds have to lie and say they're 16. Until now, they just lie and say they're 13, but now they'll have to start lying and saying they're 16. So the big thing we need is age verification with and enforcement. That would be a global game changer, and I'm very excited that Australia looks like they're going to do it. Britain is moving in that direction. Several U.S. states like Florida, are passing laws saying you have to be 16 to open an account. So I think the world is moving that way, and I hope you'll consider it in Brazil too.
Certo, Michel?
Jonathan, eu fiquei muito surpreso que no final do seu livro você propõe que os jovens, até 14 anos não tenham smartphones e até 16 não tenham acesso às redes sociais. Só que você sabe bem, que o mundo vem se tornando um lugar cada vez mais desigual. E nós, como antropólogos ou psicólogos sociais, a gente precisa levar também em contexto para poder fazer as suas recomendações. Eu fico pensando, olhando para o cenário da América Latina e também para os Estados Unidos, certamente, que os celulares nas periferias, eles assumem papéis muito importantes. Eles tiram os jovens da rua, de perto da violência, e colocam dentro de casa. Em famílias com pouca escolarização, os vídeos no YouTube permitem que os professores de YouTube ajudem a formação dessas crianças. E a gente também consegue fazer com que os jogos online ocupem um espaço de entretenimento para quem não tem praça ou espaço público para brincar. Olhando para médio prazo e para curto prazo, para famílias que não vão poder tirar o celular do bolso das crianças agora, o que você sugere?
Yeah. So first, let's look at the equity and social class issues. In the United States, in the 1990s, we talked about the digital divide. We thought rich kids have computers and internet access, but kids from low social class, they don't have access. So we have to get them computers. We have to get them a high-speed internet in the 2000s. And we thought, it's so important in schools. At least in school, every kid should have a computer. And so we thought this was an equity issue. And many philanthropists gave money so that schools could buy iPads and Chromebooks. And of course, the companies are pushing them on schools. Because they're fighting between the Apple world and the Google world. So around 2012, our schools became flooded with educational technology. What is the effect? The digital divide has reversed. When you look at the data on screen use and everything else, what you find is that children from wealthy families have many more restrictions. They have many more controls on what they do. They spend many fewer hours a day on this, whereas the further down you go in SES, the further down you go, the greater the use, the greater the abuse, the greater the bad things that happen, the greater the addiction, and the greater the distraction. So when we look at the schools, if you look at the founders of the technology companies, if you go to Silicon Valley, what you find is that a lot of them send their kids to the Waldorf school, which has zero technology, zero, because these people know what the technology does to kids. They limit it for their own kids. Many do not let their children have it. They don't let their children on social media. They don't let their nannies. Some of them make their nanny, the nanny has to sign a contract saying she will not take out her phone around the child. They know how bad this stuff is, so they protect their children from it. But the further down you go in SES, the more the children are exposed to it. So the digital divide has now reversed. The rich kids have protections. The poor kids, to hell with them, give them a device when they're 3 or 4, let them sit there and spend their whole childhood on a screen. So this is an emergency. If you care about low-income people and low-income children, this is an emergency, especially for them. The problems among rich kids are not nearly as severe. Now, of course, there are different neighborhoods, and perhaps it's more dangerous in poor neighborhoods for the kids to go out to play. There's more crime. So we do need to be more thoughtful about how we give children free play. And one simple solution, which I co-founded a group called Let Grow. If you go to letgrow.org, a simple solution, we call it Play Club. If every school would just leave their school playground open for 2 or 3 hours after school, and there's going to be an adult nearby, not monitoring, not telling kids what to do, but just in case of emergency, there is an adult around, but to give them 2 or 3 hours just to run around. Because if you don't, they're going to go home and be on their devices. So we have to be more thoughtful about it, but we have to do it.
Mas isso aqui, num país como o Brasil, tão desigual, a gente tem as favelas aqui, em que isso não seria viável. Cabe mais ao poder público do que aos educadores e aos pais, você imagina, prover esses espaços.
Okay, that would be great. I think that might be what's needed. We just have to think about how to get there. In the past, we didn't have to think about how to get there because all the kids went out to play. That's just what kids did. I grew up in the 1970s during a crime wave. We had a lot of crime in America in the 1970s and 80s, but all children went out to play. And then crime dropped very sharply in the 1990s. It became much safer, but that's exactly when we became afraid of our neighbors, afraid of kidnapping, and we stopped letting kids out.
Certo, Leon.
Professor, a gente já falou de uma das primeiras críticas ao seu trabalho, que é a questão dos dados causais que não existem. Nós temos correlação, nós temos dados longitudinais, alguns dados experimentais que são importantes, mas eles não permitem, segundo os críticos, afirmar causa. Mas o que mais me preocupa a eles e os especialistas que eu mesmo conversei é que eles dizem que o foco excessivo nas redes sociais e no celular talvez seja simplista e não nos permita dar tanto foco e também em outras questões que sejam tão importantes quanto. Recentemente saiu esse relatório da Lancet Commission de Saúde Mental da Juventude, que reúne especialistas do mundo inteiro, inclusive a Jean Twenge, com quem você trabalha bastante, e eles falam sobre as mega tendências globais que poderiam ajudar a explicar essa epidemia de problemas de saúde mental na juventude. Eles citam o uso exagerado de mídias sociais, mas eles citam algumas outras coisas, como desigualdade intergeracional aumentada, erosão da segurança do trabalho no mundo todo, perspectivas reduzidas de adquirir uma casa e a crise de aluguel que afeta vários e vários países. Eu questiono se você acha que realmente esse foco excessivo nos celulares e nas redes sociais pode ser simplista e o que você acha desses outros fatores levantados ali como apontados como de risco para explicar essa crise.
Sure. So first of all, nothing about my book is simplistic. I don't say this is all social media. My book is about the radical change in childhood that happened, especially between 2010 and 2015, but had roots for several decades before. My book is about childhood. My recommendations are not primarily about social media. Social media is a central actor in the story for girls. It's not the central actor in the story for boys. There's a lot more going on with boys. So when critics say that I say it's all social media, that's just false. They haven't read the book. So this is a complicated developmental puzzle. And in the book and in my writing, I go through why are there cultural variations? What other factors interact? That's the first point. The second point, the claim that, it's not the arrival of the phone-based childhood, it's something else about poverty. Well, of course, poverty matters. But did everyone suddenly get poor in 2012? Like, none of these theories can explain why everything changed in 2012. All of these efforts to say, it's because of racism, or it's because of Donald Trump, or it's because of something, or global warming, none of them can explain why it all began to go up around the world around 2012, 2013. So I don't think these other explanations work, although I've not seen this Lancet article. Thank you, I will look that up. But back to the first thing you said was that there's no causal evidence. That is not true. There are thousands of correlational studies, but there are a few dozen true experiments that used random assignment to people, to usually college students, not teens, unfortunately, but they use random assignment, and then they say, reduce your social media use for a few weeks, and let's track how you're doing. A meta-analysis was published last year that looked at all of these and said, oh, well, the effect is so tiny, it's almost zero. But my team, we went into that meta-analysis because, wait, what are these 27 studies? And what we discovered was that it was a giant blender study. That is, they took the experiments that went for a few weeks, which is what you need to get past withdrawal symptoms. If you take social media away from kids, the first few days, they don't feel good. It takes a couple of weeks, at least a week or two, before you start getting the benefits. So if you split out the ones that went a couple of weeks versus the ones that went one day, what this author did was he put in the experiments that went one day of deprivation, and he put in a bunch of other experiments that were about exposing kids to something. In other words, he blended everything together and found nothing. That's the usual pattern. What we did is we said, no, let's just take the ones that went on for at least a week. Guess what? Almost all of them showed a benefit. So those who say, oh, it's all correlational, no, there are about 15 of these experiments that almost all show a benefit from getting off social media. So if we have the correlational studies, we have the correlations are much larger than is said if you focus on social media, girls, and anxiety, depression. So we have the correlations, we have the experiments, we have the testimony of whistleblowers in the companies attesting to massive harm at an industrial scale, and we have the self-report of the kids. Young people themselves don't particularly like social media. In a study that we recently did, we found almost half of them wish that TikTok was never invented. They spend hours a day on it, but they wish it didn't exist. So everything is lining up to say, wait a second, these things are designed to addict kids. The companies say they're hurting kids, or at least their internal memos say they're hurting kids. The kids say they're being hurt. The parents say our kids are being hurt. Everything is lining up except for a small group of experimenters or researchers who say, let's only look at the blender studies. Let's only look at the correlational studies that mix everything together. And, oh, the effects are too small to worry about.
Com isso, então, a gente fecha o nosso segundo bloco do Roda Viva com o Jonathan Haidt, vai para mais um rápido intervalo e volta já já discutindo essa geração ansiosa e o que fazer para deixá-la menos ansiosa.
Educação que transforma. Bradesco.
Estamos de volta com Roda Viva, que hoje tem a honra de trazer o Jonathan Haidt, autor de um grande best-seller, A Geração Ansiosa. Quem pergunta para ele agora é a Isabela Palhares.
Professor, um dos pontos principais do seu livro, um dos pontos que o senhor mais defende é banir os celulares das escolas. A gente vive hoje no Brasil um momento em que as escolas têm sido muito atacadas, têm sido... Grupos políticos têm lançado muita desconfiança em cima das escolas, com a acusação de que os professores estariam doutrinando os alunos. Existe até um grupo de pais que defende homeschooling para proteger os filhos do ambiente escolar. Nesse contexto, muitas vezes os pais enxergam o celular como uma forma de estender a proteção para o filho e uma forma de controlar o que acontece dentro da escola. O senhor acha que, nesse contexto, né, em que os pais sentem que eles precisam controlar o que acontece até mesmo dentro da escola, os pais vão entender e vão aceitar o banimento do celular no ambiente escolar?
So let's break this problem down into two. The first is this good for the kids? Is it good for the kids to be in touch with their parents all the time? Is it good for their parents to text them during class and for them to see the text and respond during class? Is it good for parents to feel that they can control every aspect of their life? And I think the answer to all of these questions is no. I don't see any justification for parents interacting with their children during the school day. Now, what you refer to seems to be a decline of trust along political lines, political polarization. We have the same thing here. The educational establishment in almost all countries is going to lean to the left. There's many reasons for that. And in recent years, I think education has become more ideological in the United States. So I understand the distrust that conservatives have for some of the things that happen in school. That's an important political issue. Does that mean that children should have a smartphone with them all the time? And there again, the answer is no. There are ways to find out what's happening in class. Your child can just tell you. You don't need, you don't need your child to be taking a video of what's happening. And imagine being in a class. Imagine being a teacher where students are routinely recording it and taking anything you say out of context, and it can be put up on social media, and now the whole world is angry at you. Imagine teaching under those circumstances. That's actually kind of what's happened to us. As a professor, I have to be very careful what I say now because everyone has a phone, and if everyone records something and they put it up on social media, who knows what would happen. So I don't see any real benefit from having it. Now, in the United States, the main argument I get against this is, oh, what about school shootings? Now, I don't know if you have this in Brazil, but in the United States, we have many young men who are disconnected and they read a manifesto online from another person who shot up a school. And so every year we have several mass shootings in our schools. And some parents say, I want to be able to talk to my child if there's an emergency. But what the experts say is that if you want to keep your child safe, they should be quiet. They should follow directions because they all have these drills. In America, our students have to do shooter drills. What do you do? Where do you go? How do we coordinate? And so if there's a real emergency, the last thing you want, students pulling out their phones and crying to their parents. What you want, the experts say, is for them to follow directions, be quiet. The teacher has a phone, all the adults have a phone. That's the thing to do. So I don't know if that addressed your question. Will parents accept it? What we find in the United States is a few of them won't. There are a few who say, no, I have to be able to talk to my child all the time. But the great majority of parents support it. And once they see how it works, once they see that their kids are happier, that the kids are learning more, I mean, that counts for an awful lot.
Januária.
Voltando para a questão do celular na escola, no momento que o Brasil está para decidir via Ministério da Educação a proibição do aparelho durante as aulas. Conversando com um jovem, ele me disse, quando a aula é interessante, eu não me distraio com nada, nem celular, nem com nenhuma outra coisa. Será que nós não estamos transferindo, para o celular toda essa epidemia de falta de atenção, quando, na verdade, a gente deveria buscar conteúdos e formas de atrair, de abordar questões que são realmente importantes para as crianças e jovens? Gostaria de saber o que o senhor pensa.
Oh, my goodness. Boy, this really points to the depth of the problem. I see this in my students at NYU, too. Imagine if you are raised so that you never have to be bored, not one moment. Our young people now, of course, they take their phones into the bathroom with them. Many of us adults do, too. Now that the iPhone is waterproof, they take it into the shower. Some of them take it into the shower to listen to music, and some of them respond to texts in the shower. In an elevator, everyone pulls out their phone. If a lecture is boring, everyone pulls out their phone. Well, it turns out that daydreaming, letting your mind wander, is actually a very important part of creativity. I just talked with my students about this yesterday, and they agreed they never have moments of thought. Everything is content. There's always content coming in. And if something isn't interesting enough, well, let's just switch the content. And they generally agreed that this has made them less creative. That one boy said, I used to be really creative. I had all kinds of ideas. I built things. And then I got a phone. And then that's all I do. So what that teacher is saying is true. Many kids think, this is boring. I should pull out my phone. But we can't cater to that. We can't say, okay, then let's make the teacher more interesting than the phone. No, let's say we need to teach young people to pay attention to things even when they're boring. And if they really want to zone out, it's much better for them to have random thoughts and daydreams, a little time to process, than it is to just stuff them full of content, because our kids are stuffed full of content from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. Some of them have no real time to think.
A gente tem também, Jonathan, uma discussão grande sobre se estamos numa era de excesso de diagnósticos, de transtornos mentais, de transtornos ligados a déficit de atenção, ao espectro autista e muita medicação de criança precocemente. Você acha que o que veio primeiro, né? O excesso de telas levou a isso? Ou se a gente tirar as telas, a gente pode, inclusive, começar a ver um decréscimo da quantidade de medicação e de diagnóstico de crianças?
Yeah. So first, on the question of diagnosis, this has been going on for decades. There's what's called concept creep. So what counts as trauma used to be very, very serious, and now the definition gets lower and lower. But that's been happening for many decades. What counts as depression? What counts as child abuse? All of that, we have concept creep, where the threshold gets lower and lower. Is it too low? Perhaps in some. That's not my area of expertise. But the point is that was very gradual over many decades, since the 1970s or 80s. That cannot explain why the levels of diagnosed mental illness were constant. They didn't go down or up. They were constant for many, many years until 2011. And then all of a sudden, 2012, 2013, they all go shooting up. That's not because in 2012, psychiatrists all decided, hey, let's lower the standards a lot. And it certainly wasn't the case that psychiatrists all over the world decided, hey, let's lower the standards a lot. That didn't happen. So the changing diagnostic criteria is interesting, but I don't see any connection between that and the teen mental health crisis. They're not moving together in time. So I think that if we delay smartphones, if we delay getting a smartphone until, well, in America, I say high school, we need to get it out of middle school. But in the rest of the world, you have different school divisions. So I think age 14 should be the minimum age, not the recommended age, but the minimum age for a smartphone. Now, remember, the kids are still going to have access to a computer at home. They can still get to the whole internet. They can have a flip phone or a basic phone, so they can still text you when they're out. You can still call them. What I'm saying is they must not have the greatest distraction advice ever. They must not have a machine that lets men all over the world get to them without your knowledge. They should not have this until at least the age of 14.
Está aberta a roda. Maria Clara.
Jonathan, de geração em geração a gente vê novas tecnologias surgindo aí que sempre vem acompanhada com um certo nível de preocupação. Rádio, televisão, com propagandas super ostensivas para as crianças, que até o governo teve que regulamentar em muitos países. Agora os smartphones, as redes sociais, e agora a gente vê o crescimento, o surgimento da inteligência artificial. Você acha que essa pode afetar também a saúde mental das crianças de alguma forma? E o que fazer para se prevenir com relação a isso?
So I've written a couple of articles on how artificial intelligence is going to transform so much of our lives, and it is going to make almost all of the bad things about social media, it's going to make them much worse. So, for example, one thing about social media and the phone-based childhood is our children are very lonely. If you're spending 5 hours a day connecting with thousands of people or hundreds of people online, you don't have any time to see your friends. And that's what we see. In America, time with friends, it used to be about 2 hours a day young people would spend. Then once they get their phones, that drops to less than an hour a day. So so our young people are very lonely, especially the boys. The boys, while they can connect on video games, but it's not the same as being together and wrestling or having adventures. So social media and the digital life has made our kids very lonely. What's the solution? Well, this year we're seeing a lot of AI companions. The solution is an AI friend. The solution, and especially for boys now, an AI girlfriend. If you can't make eye contact with a girl, you can't flirt, you never learn how, you're awkward, you're lonely, have an AI girlfriend. She's much sexier than any girl in your class. She will not fight with you. She's clever and witty. You can dial up how much you want her to be sexy or flirty or dirty or naughty. Soon they'll be implanted in robots. We'll have, in fact, the Chinese are just beginning to do this. You have a sex robot, a sex doll that has ChatGPT, or I don't know what they're using, but you have a sex doll with AI in her, so you can actually have a three-dimensional girlfriend who talks to you. I don't think this is solving the problem. I think this is making it a lot worse. So we have to establish this year, in 2024, we have to establish the principle that children are not adults, that technologies that help adults achieve their ends may block children from developing. In fact, I think that's what's happening. So the phone-based life already blocks children's development. It stunts their growth, especially for the boys. The boys are not turning into men. And AI is going to make that so much worse. The video games and the pornography are going to be so mind-blowing, so incredibly enticing that a lot of boys are just going to disappear. That's already happening, but it's going to speed up. They'll just do that stuff and they'll live with their parents. And we don't know what happens when they reach their 40s, but they just live with their parents.
Michel.
Jonathan, você, num momento do livro, diz que a infância no celular é bloqueadora de experiências. E a gente sabe que as experiências são fundamentais, não só para a humanização, mas também para a solidariedade social e para a continuidade dos grupos. Você falou muito do ponto de vista individual, assim, do preço que a gente paga por estar muito no celular. Mas olhando para a sociedade, que custos são esses que você acha que a gente vai pagar daqui para frente?
What is the cost for society? So I'll give you there are many, many costs to society. So here are some simple ones. What is the cost to society if our children are less well educated? Because that is happening around the world. Our children know less. The PISA data set, international data set on education, shows education levels were stable until 2012, and now they're dropping. And it wasn't because of COVID, or at least it started before COVID. So what is the cost to society of a global decline in education? I think it's very high. We're finding that young people read very few books. They're just consuming little bits of content. What is the cost to a society of having a generation that isn't reading books, that isn't learning from previous generations, that is not aware of the greatest works of literature and art that were created, that were passed down for generations? I think that cost is very high. We're seeing an enormous increase in the number of young women who say they don't ever want to have children. And we're seeing an enormous increase in the number of young men who it looks like they're going to be incapable of attracting a woman and keeping her. So I think we're going to see a very big decline with Gen Z in rates of marriage and childbearing. What is the cost to society if levels of marriage and childbearing go down sharply? Well, we can look at Korea to see what happens when the birth rate goes down to one child per woman. And I think many of our societies are headed that way. What is the cost to society of a rise in loneliness and a decline in trust? Robert Putnam wrote a really powerful book in the year 2000 called Bowling Alone. I think it's known internationally. It's about the decline of social capital, the decline of networks of trust. So what happens when nobody trusts anyone? With AI, in 2 years, we won't know what's true. You'll see amazing videos. There's no way to know what is true. So what is the cost when we can't trust anything or anyone? I think the cost to society is very high. And this is where we're headed very, very quickly, not in 20 years, but in 2 or 3.
Isabel.
Unless we act now to say, stop, at least stop this for the children.
Jonathan, apesar da gente ter visto algumas mudanças pontuais aí nas regras das Big Techs, a gente vê que elas não têm um grande interesse em fazer essas mudanças que são necessárias para a gente proteger as crianças, como a verificação de idade, né? Pelo contrário, elas cada dia mais desenvolvem ferramentas, estratégias para atrair cada vez mais adolescentes e crianças mais novas. A gente vê aqui no Brasil influencers com 4, 5 anos. O senhor acha que é responsabilidade dos governos frear essas empresas? Não dá para a gente esperar que elas façam essas mudanças?
Yes, it is the role of government to create fair markets where companies create products that people want and that do not harm other people, and especially that do not harm children. When products are causing mass harm to millions of children, we ban them instantly, except with this one. With this one, we just accept it. Now, America created this problem for the world. The companies are all American on the West Coast, in California especially. We created this problem. We told the companies, nobody can sue you. You can do whatever you want. You can take whatever children you want. You don't need to check their ages. Just make them say they're 13 and you're fine. And these are publicly traded companies that feel an obligation to maximize shareholder value. So they're in competition with each other to grab younger and younger children. So we created this problem. Now, can we solve it? No, for two reasons. One is the companies are the richest companies in the world, and America has a political system where it's very cheap to buy influence. It's amazing how little money it takes. You know, a few $1 million, you can have a huge influence on Congress. That's insane, but that's what we have. Also, we're so politically polarized that while there's complete agreement for now on phone-free schools, on protecting kids, there is complete agreement for protecting kids, but age verification is going to involve trade-offs with full privacy and anonymity. And if that's the case, then the libertarian elements of our society are going to object strongly. And in America, we can't pass anything complicated. We can't do anything really in our Congress unless one party controls everything, which rarely happens. So we created the problem. We are incapable of solving it. We are never going to require age verification at the congressional level. States are doing it, but the US Congress is probably never going to do it. That's why we need you. That's why we need the other countries to do it. Because so Australia's leading, if Brazil were to join in and the EU were to join in, if all of these countries were to say, this insane American thing that you've imposed on the world, you've unleashed this on the world, you're not controlling your dog, as it were, the rest of the world has to come together and say, well, damn it, we're going to control it. We're going to say, no more for our kids. You can't do this to 9-year-olds. You have to verify if you're going to provide a service that includes pornography, violence, addiction, dangerous challenges. If you're going to provide this service to 9-year-olds, you have an obligation to age verify. You figure it out. You figured out everything before. You can create advertising markets with billions of pieces of information that conduct a full auction for advertisements in less than 1/10 of a second. Surely you can figure out whether someone is 16 or not.
Certo. Com isso, então, a gente encerra este bloco, vai para mais um intervalo e volta já para o encerramento do Roda Viva com o Jonathan Haidt.
Educação que transforma. Bradesco.
Estamos de volta com o Roda Viva, que hoje recebe o autor do livro A Geração Ansiosa, Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan, você falou de acesso a conteúdos pornográficos, a gente discutiu um pouco o quanto a internet e as redes sociais estão influindo nos relacionamentos interpessoais, mas eu queria trazer um pouco a política para essa discussão. A gente falou bastante de polarização, mas não como o acesso aos conteúdos produzidos por essa polarização podem levar a jovens cada vez mais radicalizados do ponto de vista do pensamento político e como a cidadania não se exerce mais na polis ali, né, na praça, em que você debate diferentes pontos de vista, mas compra o seu, se sente ali feliz naquela bolha e reproduz isso eternamente. Você acha que, do ponto de vista da radicalização política, esse acesso precoce às redes sociais também é um problema?
Oh, yes, it's a very, very big problem. I was originally going to write a full book on this, on what social media is doing to democracies around the world. But then I saw what it was doing to kids, and I realized I have to start with that. That's the most important. But I'm going to be writing a book on exactly this question. And if you think about it, democracy is a conversation. This is what Noah Yuval Harari says. Democracy is a kind of a conversation, and out of that conversation comes consensual government, comes limitations on government, and this is what has been working for a very long time in the United States, at least. And what if suddenly you take that conversation and you put it in the middle of the Roman Colosseum? Of course, in the Roman Colosseum, people would pay money to come and watch people kill each other. and they would watch humans fight with animals, and they would watch animals kill each other. It was blood sport. It was exciting. It was degrading. That's not a conversation. That's a spectacle where people in the stands are rooting, they're applauding for good attacks. That's what democracy has become in the United States. It's not a conversation where neighbors might be restrained by the fact that they live together. It's a screaming match among strangers on platforms that specifically limit the amount of content, especially for Twitter. So all of the assumptions about democracy that went into the founding of the United States, our founding fathers were very good psychologists. All of those assumptions are now violated. And the effect on the citizens, the effect on the politicians is gigantic. We don't know the full effect, but one seems to be that the politicians are not able to compromise with each other because they will be crucified on social media by the extremes in their party. So we get very little cooperation in America now. It's the two parties are like bitter enemies that want to kill each other. And I don't think it's going to work. I don't think democracy is going to work if it continues in this way.
Certo, Leão.
Professor, quando os pesquisadores perguntam para os jovens, redes sociais, smartphone estão fazendo mal para a sua saúde mental, o que a gente encontra, e eu acho muito curioso, são resultados misturados. Em geral, é meio a meio. Óbvio, se a gente olhar para grupos específicos LGBT, mulheres é diferente. Recentemente, o senhor publicou um desses levantamentos que encontrou resultados que conversam com o que outros pesquisadores também já tinham visto, essa coisa de 50-50. Eu queria te perguntar como é que a gente entende esse resultado.
So one way to understand it would be to think about it as a vote, and the vote is divided. But that's not what we do with consumer products for children. Imagine if there was a consumer product, some toy that was very exciting, and 80% said they love it, and 20% said, I've been injured by this thing. You know, it cut me, it cut off my ear, I was emotionally damaged by it. Well, 80-20, I mean, this is obviously a very good toy, right? No, with consumer products for children, we say if it's killing even just a few of them, I mean, if it's only killing, in the United States, about 10 or 12 children a year die from choking on toy parts, and we put warnings on that. But in the peak year of the choking challenge, the TikTok challenge, where you're supposed to strangle yourself, more than that number died. So TikTok itself kills more children than all the toys combined in terms of choking. This is not a vote. This is not a 50-50 thing. If there are vast numbers of children who are being hurt by a consumer product, we ban it.
Januário.
Professor, gostaria de saber a sua opinião sobre a educação midiática. O senhor deu 4 conselhos, 4 atitudes possíveis de serem tomadas já, mas a gente sabe da importância da educação para o uso adequado das mídias e a educação é sempre um processo a longo prazo. Como é que o senhor vê a questão da educação midiática, não apenas nas escolas, mas para toda a sociedade?
Well, I think it should be done, but I don't think it's going to have a big effect. I think people are not understanding that social media is socially addictive. It is biologically addictive for some heavy users, but the main addiction is social. That is, if everyone else is on it, I have to be on it. I don't want to miss out. I need to know what's going on. And so you can educate them all you want, but that's their conscious mind. You're telling, as with smoking education, as with drug education, it doesn't have much effect on their behavior because teenagers are much more influenced by what their peers are doing than by any information you could give them about their health. I think it's fair to say that most young people would be happy to take a risk with their health if it kept them in a state of high prestige. And if faced with a drop in prestige, they would willingly take a hit to their health, especially if it was many years in the future. So sure, we should do education. I'm a professor, I believe in education, but the tobacco industry urged education instead of bans. Every industry that's hurting children urges education as the solution instead of them taking responsibility. So I'm not impressed by what I've seen about the move for those who call for education instead of reform or regulation.
Mas eu acho que quando a colega fala em educação midiática, ela também fala em educar esses jovens e essas crianças para se informar da maneira apropriada e não consumir desinformação e fake news que vem muito por meio dessas mídias, num momento em que o jornalismo enfrenta graves problemas para chegar nesse público mais jovem. Sob esse aspecto de educação midiática, o que o senhor acha que seria eficaz?
No, I don't. I don't think that would be effective at all. The mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict, like a small rider on top of a large elephant. The small rider is our conscious reasoning. The large elephant is all the automatic, intuitive social processes. You can lecture the rider all you want. You can say, look, be careful about fake news, and here's how you can tell. You can lecture the rider all you want, but the rider's not in control. The emotional, intuitive elephant is in control. And it's going to be influenced by what it sees. Even if it knows this is not true, it's going to be influenced. These social forces are so powerful. And especially for a child, I mean, even for adults, it's hard for us to just change our behavior. But for a child to change his behavior because of what the teacher said, or to change his interpretations because of what the teacher said, when all of the stuff coming in on TikTok creates an intuitive frame, direct education is no match for that. This is why I say let's at least delay till 16.
Michelle.
Jonathan, olhando para os estudiosos da tecnologia e do impacto disso na nossa vida, eu acho que a gente pode dividir dois grandes grupos. De um lado, você tem o pessoal que crê que a tecnologia é a solução para tudo e gera uma certa euforia. E de outro lado, você tem os fatalistas, que geram um certo desalento. Quando eu li teu livro, eu fiquei um pouco desalentado. Você se considera um fatalista?
Yeah. No, I'm not at all. I love technology, and let's be clear. The tech industry is thousands of companies that make our lives better, and 3 or 4 companies that now control human childhood and are stomping on it. So it's really just a few companies we're talking about here that are doing most of the damage. I used to be a techno-optimist, but now I think that our technology is advancing so fast that our societies cannot keep up with it, and we're going to have very high levels of chaos and change in the coming decades. So in that sense, yes, I am fairly negative, that's true. But when we look at what's happening with kids, I am just astonished at how fast things are changing. My book came out in March. And since then, schools are going phone-free all over the world. Countries are passing laws raising the age. Everyone was ready to act. Any adult, most of the adults who deal with children saw the problem. They didn't have the coordination device to say, here's what we do, let's do it together. So I'm actually very optimistic that we're going to take childhood back from these 3 or 4 companies, and all that time that they're spending on these 3 or 4 platforms, we're going to give it back to kids to actually play with each other. I'm very confident that we're going to do that at a large scale over the coming years.
Maria Clara.
Jonathan, e o bullying? Apesar de todas as ações, a gente vê que essa é uma preocupação muito grande na comunidade escolar, pelo menos aqui no Brasil, acredito que nos Estados Unidos também. A gente vê que os números crescem, mesmo com essas ações. Foram 121 mil casos registrados em cartórios aqui no Brasil, que dá uma média superior a mais de 10 mil casos por mês. Você não acha que essa é uma parcela significativa também para afetar a saúde mental das crianças e dos jovens?
Oh, of course. I mean, bullying, so to be clear, bullying is not aggression. It is aggression or power assertion over many days. And when it's over many days, then you have a kid who doesn't want to go to school, who is anxious all the time. But at least on weekends, it used to be, at least on weekends, they're not being bullied. But that's not true anymore. Now that the bullying has moved on to social media platforms, now it can go on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are many known cases in the United States and in Britain of young people who were being bullied, and then they killed themselves. Their parents didn't even know they were being bullied. They didn't even know it. It was all happening online. The kid was ashamed. The teachers, nobody knew it. The adults didn't know it. At least if it happens in school, the teachers will find out about it. So children are vulnerable to bullying all over the world, especially around age 12, 13. It's very intense, most intense around there. And that's exactly the age that we give them social media. And so they do it there, and it's more brutal and it's more shaming. And I think it's more powerful and painful.
Isabela, para a última do programa.
Jonathan, você fala muito sobre a diferença de como as redes sociais afetam meninos e meninas, que para as meninas o efeito seria mais perverso, mais danoso. Mas assim como nos Estados Unidos, a gente viveu aqui no Brasil uma onda de ataques contra escolas e os autores são sempre meninos, né? E sempre tem um histórico do episódio ser pensado dentro das redes sociais. Você acha que um uso mais controlado das redes sociais poderia evitar esses casos de agressão tão graves que a gente viveu e vocês vivem aí nos Estados Unidos?
Well, yes. If we had, if each country imposes an age limit of 16 to open a social media account, and if the companies are forced to age verify, then we would have, there might be some kids who would get around it, but it would not be that most kids are on it. So again, there is no way to make this safe. When you network children, especially connect them to strangers, there's no way to make it safe. Raise the age, and yes, that would reduce some of the craziness and the carnage.
Jonathan, te agradeço muitíssimo por essa entrevista tão esclarecedora. Já fica aqui a dica para todo mundo do livro. Essa é a versão em papel, para não deixar ninguém com a atenção fragmentada, para poder mergulhar no livro. Muito obrigada.
My pleasure, thank you.
É isso, nosso programa chegou ao fim. Além de agradecer imensamente ao Jonathan Haidt pela entrevista, eu também estendo esses agradecimentos à bancada que conduziu a conversa comigo. Michel Alcoforado, Maria Clara Cabral, Leon Ferrari, Isabela Palhares, Januária Cristina Alves, Luciano Veronese e Leslie Benzaquem. Obrigada, sobretudo, a você pela sua audiência a cada semana em relação aos mais diferentes assuntos que a gente traz aqui. A justa medida entre restrições ao acesso de jovens à tecnologia e a necessidade de usá-la no dia a dia como ferramenta para segurança, comunicação e no próprio processo de aprendizado tem fritado a cabeça de especialistas e pais, cada vez mais perdidos sobre como proceder. Escolas brasileiras, como a gente abordou aqui, começaram a adotar a proibição a celulares. Vai levar algum tempo e muita observação até que tenhamos dados confiáveis a respeito de se essas medidas levarão, de fato, a uma melhoria em marcadores de saúde mental e no próprio ambiente escolar. Mas se os limites não forem aplicados em casa, depois que a criança ou o jovem cruza os portões da escola, de pouco ou nada vai adiantar. Há um desafio para os pais de como recolocar os seus filhos no mundo real, para que lidem com pequenos riscos e tenham interações sociais que vão prepará-los para resolver problemas quando eles forem adultos. Para quem quiser uma ajuda sobre o que fazer, o livro do Jonathan Haidt fornece muitos dados e algumas respostas. Roda Viva fica aqui e volta na próxima segunda-feira, como sempre, com um debate para fazer pensar. Eu espero você. Até lá.
Educação que transforma. Bradesco.